Hello again. I'm Shelley, resident of Victoria, Australia, and someone who loves to travel. This is the next instalment in my project of seeing as much as I can on the recently capped public transport costs in Victoria. This trip was just for the day out to what I think is one of Victoria's best kept secrets and only cost me $7.20. I started at the V-Line website again. What I actually wanted to do was go to Coal Creek, then walk back into Korumburra and get the coach back from there. As I haven't figured out how to open jaw these bookings when booking online, I just booked to and from Korumburra. Then I asked the driver if I could go to Coal Creek, and after briefly joking about making me walk, he said of course that was fine. The search result gave me a number of possible selections. Initially, I wanted an early morning journey out, but this was the first direct, and that was my preference. I did at one point toy with the idea of taking the one that left around 7 in the morning and involved multiple changes before noticing that the last leg of that journey was actually on the same coach, so they both would have got in at 11. For the return journey, I would have preferred earlier, but the next one before was just before 3 p.m. and I thought that might be cutting it fine. So I booked the later. I ultimately got through everything I really wanted to do by 2:45. I called V-Line from the bus stop to see if I could change to the earlier. She said I could ask the driver, but she couldn't promise. When I did ask him, he said my ticket was valid for the whole day, so it was fine. So this is what I booked, but neither trip was exactly what I ended up doing. It's also probably worth noting that the on the ground times were actually a minute earlier than the V-Line website. So for example, in the morning, they were actually announcing it was leaving at 9:02. Um, I, I wouldn't suggest cutting it that fine anyway, but I thought I should mention it. So there you go, $7.20. It was just me today as the rest of the family had other plans. This was a paper ticket again, so I picked it up from Flinders Street V-Line office the night before, but I could have picked it up on the morning from Southern Cross. I just like to have everything that I can prepared in advance. I fully intended to get a photo of Southern Cross Station when it wasn't dark, but I was inside before I remembered and couldn't be bothered going back out to the other side of the road. So here's a couple of photos of the inside of Southern Cross Station, which is also where the coach bay is. I'm walking towards it here in this photo. So today's mode of transport, like I mentioned earlier, is by coach. That's the only way to get out there by public transport. It does still have the convenience of someone else driving you, so you can do other things, but I do find that I get a bit more travel sick on coaches than I do on trains. And also on trains, there's usually a tray table, so as long as you book the right seat. So while I was able to actually get a bit of work done, I did have to sort of stop and look out the window, sometimes close my eyes. So um, next time I travel by coach, I'm going to make sure I have an audiobook or podcast to listen to. And this is just our trip heading out. So, yep, the coach dropped me off at Coal Creek. It's right there. There's no charge to enter. They told us that only some of the buildings were open, but that we could look through the windows of those that weren't. The reason for only a few buildings being open is because they haven't had many volunteers come back since the pandemic restrictions. None of the buildings were staffed, so you couldn't sort of buy lollies at the corner store, for example. There was still heaps to see, and you are welcome to take a packed lunch, which is what I did. And it was commented by the lady at reception that you can't even get a cup of coffee there these days. But like I did notice as I came outside, there are a couple of barbecues outside the park, just outside. So if you wanted a hot lunch, there's self catering options even for heated lunch. There's a small display in the reception building, but the main attraction consists of those buildings outside. Now, at first, I couldn't work out how I had missed this when I had been before, but then I remembered that I was a leader in a group that included about 100 Cub Scouts, which may have contributed to a little bit less information going in. However, I thought this was really interesting. Coal Creek is set at the location of the old coal mine, that is Coal Creek, and it's set out kind of like a mining town, although when it was a mine, there are a lot less buildings here. The buildings themselves, though, are actually mostly from later periods. What happened is that buildings were due to be demolished or whatever to make way for new developments, and the community decided that they wanted to preserve them. They therefore moved the buildings to Coal Creek and turned it into a tourist attraction. So most of the buildings will have a plaque with the information about the building, which is usually from the early 1900s, even though they're kind of playing this role within the Coal Creek mining town, which is sort of set in the 1800s. It makes for this glorious hodgepodge with heaps of historical information that's still kind of a little bit of a theme park feel for a slightly different time. The train is probably one of the things that stuck out most in my memory from when I had been there last. They used to have a little tourist train going around as well, but that's not running at the moment. And here's a bit more of that station area and inside the train itself. There are numerous places to stop and have a picnic lunch. I spent my brief time having my sandwich reading about Stagg and his involvement in the miners' strike. There are heaps of artefacts dotted around the place as well. This is the building that started it all. This courthouse was opened in 1900. When it was to be demolished in 1971, the Korumburra Historical Society paid to have it moved from its original site to the former site of the Coal Creek mine. The sign on it says, "From this single building, a historic village was born and the Coal Creek Community Park and Museum was established." I love the story of this building as well, as it shows just how kind of chaotic, which I mean in the nicest possible way, the creation of Coal Creek has been. So this building started life in 1902 as the Kilcunda Road State School. After the school was closed in 1972, it was vacant for 13 years until it was purchased by Masonic Lodge members and moved to Coal Creek. They took years to restore it and extend it, and then they used it as a Freemasons Lodge at the Coal Creek site until 2017. When this lodge was disbanded in 2017, the layout was restored to its original former schoolhouse with a display about Freemasonry in the foyer. So you've got kind of all those different eras displayed in the same place, and it's giving that whole history of the building. They had examples or replicas of everything. Um, this outhouse had two dunnies side by side, and I sort of had these horrible visions of going to the loo with someone else sitting beside you. But upon reflection, it probably makes more sense that the lower one, the shorter one, was used by the kids and other shorter people. But I still don't think potty training would have been much fun in these circumstances. So this wattle and daub hut, they call it, incorporates parts that were built in the 1840s. The roof in particular is almost entirely original. It was moved to Coal Creek in 1973. The walls were reconstructed in 1980 they used that wattle and daub technique of weaving thin branches together and covering with a daub made of mud and mixed with dung, animal hair, and straw. This was a popular technique in the 1800s. They had examples of lots of interiors. Many could only be viewed through the windows, but there's still so much to see. I spent a good couple of hours looking all around Coal Creek. If I had others with me, we probably would have spent more time, particularly over lunch, and presumably taken longer overall. However, I was done, so I walked into Korumburra to Burra, Brew and Barbecue. So Lee's family and our family are friends from back when our kids were in kinder and school together before they moved out here. So He has lots of home brewing and barbecue stuff there. There was no way I was getting one of his kits on the bus. Apparently, it's foolproof and results in beer that doesn't have an aftertaste. I was assured by one of the other customers. I actually thought aftertaste was a feature of beer, but then I'm not a fan. I did, however, pick up an awesome fajita seasoning for next time we're barbecuing. As I said earlier, I then went to the bus stop and discovered there was a bus coming along shortly, so I decided to head home mid afternoon. If I had waited until the bus I'd initially booked after 6 p.m., I would have headed into Burra Brewing Company, which is not to be confused with Burra Brew and Barbecue, which I nearly did. So luckily I spoke to Lee's wife Nikki and realised my mistake. Lee did recommend that if you are going to the Burra Brewing Company, that their wood-fired pizzas are really nice. So for the day I had, because I didn't go there, I had just packed a cut lunch and some snacks from home. So my expenses were that $7.20 for transportation. I did have a couple of optional expenses. I've already mentioned the fajita seasoning, and I also made a small donation at Coal Creek. They just had a little box there where you could donate to get the trains running again. So I didn't think that was too bad a deal for a great day out. Here are a few information sources I thought you might find interesting. And that concludes my description of my day. Thank you.